There is a civilization so old that when the pyramids were being built, it had already been continuous for 50,000 years, not as a frozen remnant, not as a people accidentally preserved by isolation. As a living, evolving, intellectually sophisticated culture that had been solving the problems of human existence on the world's most unforgiving continent, since before agriculture existed anywhere on Earth, since before any other civilization had begun. Since before the cave paintings of Europe were made, since before Neanderthals and modern humans were finishing their long overlap in the Ice Age world. The Aboriginal Australians are the oldest continuous civilization on Earth by a margin so large that the comparison is almost meaningless. Every other culture that claims deep antiquity is young by comparison. And for most of recorded Western history, this extraordinary depth was not recognized, not studied, and not respected. The people who had solved the problem of surviving in Australia for 65 millennia were described by European settlers as primitive, as people without history, as the remnant of an earlier stage of human development that more advanced societies had left behind. This was not simply ignorance. It was a deliberate misreading, motivated by the need to justify dispossession. And it was wrong in every dimension that the genetics have now made measurable. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the DNA actually shows about who the Aboriginal Australians are and where they came from. The genetic evidence for Aboriginal Australian origins has been building since the early 2000s, but the most comprehensive and transformative study came in 2016, published in the journal Nature, when a team of researchers led by Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen analyzed the full genome of a lock of hair donated to a British anthropologist in the early 20th century by an Aboriginal Australian man from the Goldfields region of Western Australia. The hair had been sitting in a museum archive for nearly a century. What the genome extracted from it revealed was a story about human migration that rewrote the timeline of how the world was peopled. The Aboriginal Australians, the data showed, descend from the first humans to leave Africa, not one of the first waves, the first. Their ancestors departed the African continent approximately 70,000 years ago, moving through the Middle East and along the southern coast of Asia in a migration that eventually reached Australia between 50 and 65,000 years ago. This was tens of thousands of years before any other population outside Africa reached any other continent. The people who became Aboriginal Australians arrived in Australia before modern humans had settled Europe, before they had moved into most of Asia, before they had crossed into the Americas. They were the vanguard of the human expansion out of Africa, and once they reached Australia, they stayed. This is the finding that contains the greatest surprise, and it is a surprise that operates on two levels simultaneously. The first level is the antiquity itself. 65,000 years of continuous habitation of a single continent is a number so large that it resists ordinary comprehension. It means that Aboriginal Australian cultures were already ancient by the time the first farmers in the Fertile Crescent began domesticating wheat. It means that the Dramtime stories, the oral traditions, the song lines, the ceremonial practices that European settlers dismissed as primitive superstition had been developing, evolving, and transmitting knowledge across generations for a period of time longer than any other living cultural tradition on Earth. Some researchers have proposed that certain Aboriginal Australian oral traditions preserve memories of specific geological events, including the inundation of coastal land by rising sea levels at the end of the last Ice Age. Events that occurred between 10 and 12,000 years ago. If those traditions do encode genuine geological memory, they represent the longest continuous historical record in human existence, preserved not in writing, but in story and song and ceremony across 500 generations. The second level of surprise is the genetic isolation. The 2016 study showed that the founding Aboriginal Australian population arrived in Australia, and then, for approximately 50,000 years, remained genetically isolated from the rest of the world. No significant gene flow from outside Australia. No major migrations in. No evidence of the population replacements and admixture events that reshaped the genetics of every other continental population during that same period. While Europe was being remade by Neolithic farmers, while the steppe pastoralists were spreading Indo-European languages across Eurasia, while the Bronze Age was connecting the Old World in networks of trade and migration that left genetic signatures across thousands of miles, Australia remained separate. The Aboriginal Australian genome of 10,000 years ago was, in all essential respects, the same as the Aboriginal Australian genome of 50,000 years ago. This is, in the entire record of human genetics, essentially unique. No other population on Earth shows this degree of long-term genetic continuity in a single place over such a span of time. But the 2016 study contained a third finding that connected the Aboriginal Australian story directly to the Denisovan story that the genetics had been building in parallel. Aboriginal Australians carry approximately 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA, the highest frequency of Denisovan ancestry in any living population on Earth. This is not a coincidence of geography. It is a record of an encounter. When the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians moved through Southeast Asia on their way to Australia 70,000 years ago, they passed through territory that Denisovans occupied, and they interbred with them. The Denisovan DNA that Aboriginal Australians carry today is the genetic record of that encounter. Preserved through 50,000 years of isolation more completely than in any other population, because the isolation prevented the subsequent dilution that reduced Denisovan ancestry in other groups through later admixture events. The Aboriginal Australians are, in this specific biological sense, the most direct living link to a human species that paleoanthropology otherwise knows only from a finger bone and some teeth in a Siberian cave. And then, in the 19th century, this population, with its 65,000 years of continuous cultural development and its unique genetic heritage connecting it to the deepest human past, encountered British colonization. The dispossession was systematic and comprehensive. Violence, forced removal from traditional lands, and deliberate destruction of the social structures that maintained cultural transmission were all deployed as tools of a colonial policy whose explicit goal, in its later phases, was the absorption and disappearance of Aboriginal identity into the broader Australian settler population. The violence was extensive enough and the dispossession thorough enough that by the early 20th century, many observers, including some who considered themselves sympathetic, believed that Aboriginal Australians as a distinct cultural and genetic population were in the process of inevitable disappearance. Children were removed from their families under government policy in a program that continued well into the 1970s, and that the Australian government formally apologized for in 2008. The stolen generations, as they are known, the Aboriginal children forcibly removed from their communities across most of the 20th century and placed in institutions or non-Aboriginal homes, represent a deliberate attempt to break the transmission chain that had been functioning without interruption for 65,000 years. Hundreds of distinct languages, each encoding specific ecological and cultural knowledge of a particular region and landscape, were suppressed. Many were lost entirely, taking with them knowledge systems that had no written backup and no parallel record anywhere else on Earth. The languages that survived did so because communities protected them, sometimes at considerable personal risk, hiding their use from authorities who had made speaking them a punishable offense. It did not fully succeed. The cultures survived in forms that colonial administrators had not anticipated. The ceremonies continued in whatever shape the circumstances permitted. The ecological knowledge was transmitted through the practices that colonists misread as subsistence activity rather than science, and the genetics, immune as always to the policies of governments and the intentions of colonizers, passed unchanged from parent to child through every year of dispossession and removal and institutional pressure. The DNA that Willerslev's team extracted from that century-old lock of museum hair in 2016 was the same DNA that had been present in Australia since before the last ice age reached its maximum extent. It had survived everything. The question this raises is larger than one continent. If a culture can maintain genuine continuity, cognitive, ceremonial, ecological, for 65,000 years, without writing, without cities, without the institutional structures that Western civilization has always assumed are necessary for the preservation of knowledge, then what does that say about what knowledge actually is and how it actually travels through time? The Aboriginal Australians developed and maintained over 65 millennia a system of knowledge transmission, encoded in song, in story, in ceremony, in the relationship between people and the specific landscapes they inhabited, that proved more durable than any written record, more persistent than any institution, more resistant to disruption than any library. The song lines that map the Australian continent in a network of sung geographical knowledge, connecting water sources and sacred sites and ecological landmarks across thousands of miles, represent a navigational and ecological database assembled and maintained over a time scale that no other knowledge system has matched. Researchers studying Aboriginal ecological knowledge have documented detailed understanding of plant behavior, animal movement patterns, fire management techniques, and water sourcing strategies that reflect not decades of observation, but generations of accumulated knowledge refined across centuries and passed forward without the loss of precision that most oral traditions experience over such spans of time. The fire management systems that Aboriginal Australians developed over tens of thousands of years, the practice of controlled burning that maintained specific vegetation patterns across the continent, were so sophisticated that modern ecologists and land managers have spent the past 3 decades attempting to understand and partially re-implement them after their suppression during the colonial period contributed to the catastrophic fire conditions that have plagued the Australian continent in recent years. This is not traditional knowledge in the sense of charming customs preserved from an earlier time. This is applied ecological science developed and refined over a period longer than any other comparable body of knowledge on Earth. The DNA is now confirming what that knowledge system always implied, that the people who built it were not primitive. They were the product of 65,000 years of continuous intellectual development in one of the most demanding environments on Earth, and the genetics are only beginning to reveal how much of what they built and how much of what they carried we are only now developing the tools to understand.